What do you think? Having 12 gigabytes of VRAM on the RTX 4070/4070 Ti is a lesser, equal, or bigger concern than the RTX 3070 and 3070 Ti with 8 gigabytes of VRAM when it launched, regarding future games, of course. So,
Well, that's a really good question.
yeah, 8 gigabytes in 2020 versus 12 gigabytes in 2023. It's an interesting discussion, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's a big deal, I think, for the 4070 Ti, being that is an $800 US price. That's $200 US more than the 3070 Ti.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, something we haven't talked about much, but, you know, there's things like inflation and that you can account for some price creep, but I'm sure not all of it. But anyway, the fact remains, we're at $800 US with a 12 gigabyte card. Is that equally concerning, more concerning, less concerning than... The thing is with the 8 gigabyte card, right? While I really only talked about the VRAM concern when we were comparing, it wasn't so much that I was concerned with 8 gigabytes specifically. It wasn't that I was like, oh, 8 gigabytes isn't going to be enough to game in the future, because you can always dial things down and make it work. I was coming at it more from the angle that, you know, the RX 6800 is not that much more expensive, like $70 US, pretty small percentage difference based on MSRP. Let's say they're available MSRP. We know with the cryptocurrency boom, but MSRP. Twice the amount of VRAM. And I'm thinking 2-3 years down the track, you better take advantage of, you know, AAA titles that have big 12 gigabyte or larger texture packs and things like that. I wasn't so much thinking ray tracing. I was just thinking basically overall textures are one of the most important things for image quality and the presentation of the game, how good it looks. So if you had twice as much VRAM, it stands to reason that at some point in time, the game will look better. And even if you go down the track to the point where, like, you know, an RX 6800 can only play using the medium quality preset because it just doesn't have enough processing power, sure, but you can still set the medium preset and jack the textures right up and the game will look amazing, whereas the 3070, you won't be able to do that. So there was always going to be a point in time where the RX 6800 just made the game look a lot better. Take a 4 gigabyte versus 8 gigabyte RX 580, for example. 580, generally you're playing at sort of medium 1080p, but using those 8 gigabyte textures look way better than the 4 gigabyte card.
If they even have 4 gig textures anymore, which they might not.
Well, you'd be lowering the textures right down to muddy, blurry, smeary garbage.
And even then, it may not work.
Well, but that's my point. So that's a real world current example we can give of this. I guess where I'm going is I didn't expect it to be a situation where the 8 gigabyte buffer meant you couldn't really utilize ray tracing to any kind of effective degree in things like Resident Evil 4, Hogwarts Legacy, the Callisto Protocol, A Plague Tale Requiem. Like, those games, you just can't do it. They all pour over to 9 gigabytes of VRAM, even with like sort of medium quality settings with ray tracing enabled. So had I known this, I would have been much more concerned about the 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer on a $500, $600 card. Again, 400 and less, maybe 400 a little bit of a concern, but again, we weren't really pushing ray tracing angles so much with like a 3060 Ti. That was more, it was a raster card, and you were you were getting into the territory where it was like high, more medium type performance card.
Yeah, and it was a really good bang for buck card for rasterization as well, which kind of...
So I think less there, and certainly much less so. I mean, the 3060 had 12 gigabytes, but like an RX 6600, which we didn't love upon launch, but that card did get heavily discounted and then became quite a good value product. Only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but you're not using ray tracing on an RX 6600. You're not playing with ultra quality settings or even high in a lot of instances, unless it's sort of a slightly older game. So I guess getting all that out of the way, 12 gigabytes. I don't really know where we'll be in a couple of years' time with VRAM usage. I suspect for a 4070 Ti performance tier, you'd really be wanting 16 gigabytes as the minimum, I think, which is why I suspect, I guess, the 4070 Ti is a more relevant comparison for how concerned are you, because you have a 7900 XT with 20 gigabytes. So if 16 gigabytes sort of becomes the required memory capacity there, it doesn't matter that it's not 20. It's more than 12. Yeah. That's a big problem for the 4070 Ti and not a problem.
1 gig more is a problem.
Well, that's right. It needs to be like 12 and a half especially with it's interesting with ray tracing enabled. It seems like you just can't spill over the VRAM buffer. You can't do it. As soon as you do it, you're likely to crash or cause all kinds of problems. If you disable ray tracing, it seems a lot more lenient with that spilling over. Of course, you can still lead into like a Forspoken, sorry. Forsaken was this really old game that I used to play. It's like a little, anyway, getting off topic, but I always say that instead of Forspoken. Bale laughs at me. Yeah, so you have more sort of wriggle room there, more leniency with spilling over the VRAM buffer without ray tracing. It seems, again, it's game engine and game dependent. But yeah, 12 gigabytes, I could see where in, especially 2 years down the track from now, we're getting a lot of games that sort of for high quality. So let's say there's an ultra preset, dialing it down one to high. I can see a world where you'd need around 16 gigs for that, especially at 1440p. So, but this is all guesswork. I don't know.
Yeah.
It was guesswork 2 years ago, and I was concerned, and I should have been more concerned.
Yeah, I think there were more signs in 2020 of 8 gig being an issue than there are today for 12 gig.
I think so.
I think back in 2020, there were more games where it was very clearly right on a knife's edge at 8 gig.
Mm-hmm.
The things like, I think back Watch Dogs Legion as an example with ray tracing, Far Cry 6 was around that time as well. There's a few other examples, but it was clear that it's like, teetering. Whereas today, there's not that many examples that seem to just be right on a knife's edge at 12 gig. There's maybe one?
I mean, it's tough because they are popping up. And we've heard developers say that, we've heard from multiple developers who are saying that 12 gigabytes of VRAM moving forward for all the AAA games that are coming up, 12 gigabytes of VRAM will be like, just get you in there at 1080p. Some are even suggesting like medium at times. So if that's true, again, we don't know because we haven't got those games yet. But if that's true, 2 years from now, 12 gigabytes will very much be struggle street. But
yeah, I think what was key at the time that 8 gigabyte cards came out is that the 3070 Ti launched around the same time as next gen consoles. We talked about it so many times. Had more VRAM. That was an obvious sort of beacon that you could see as like, well, that's going to be a problem. If they're designing games to use the greater memory capacity of those next-gen consoles, then 8 gig is going to be an issue. And that was on top of the titles, seeing some knife-edge sort of titles.
And consoles, it's not an apples-to-apples comparison, which a lot of gamers try to make out that it is, but they're much more efficient with their use of memory. So saying that consoles use this much memory, therefore PCs only, not how it works. They're very different systems, very different platforms. So yeah, you can't really, all you can say is it's using at least that much, so you're going to need more than that on the PC. That's pretty much all you can really glean from that.
Yeah, exactly. Especially as, I think even there's been discussion about features like DLSS 3 increasing VRAM requirements, which again is not something you can use on a console, so that plays into these discussions too. But I think, I think it was, the signs were there in 2020, it's just that we didn't see them, or at least didn't prioritize them as much as maybe we should have. Whereas I think today, the good thing is we're very aware of it. So when we talk about things like 12 gigabytes being an issue, we can sort of say, well, there might not be too many games on a knife's edge, but everything is pointing in that direction. Like we've seen this big increase. We know console memory's doubled. Game developers are saying, that this is an issue. So that's all pointing in that direction. But I think, again, it's hard to say. I think it was more of an issue with 8 gig in 2020 just because it should have been, the signs were there. Was I think 12 gig, I don't know, maybe we're going to get one more year out of it than 8 gig. I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah, I think we should be certainly, I would say, equally concerned with the concerns we had back then, which was...
Yeah.
And again, it really comes to what the competition is, because if you can't get more than 12 gigabytes in sort of a broad price range, then you either don't upgrade or you do. For a product like the 4070 Ti, I'm quite concerned. That's a very expensive product.
Yeah,
I mean, that's more expensive than the previous generation's sensible flagship, which was the RTX 3080 10 gigabyte.
Yes.
It's substantially more, well, it's quite a bit more expensive.
Yep.
So that, I think, is very concerning because that is a high-end product that delivers a lot of performance and should do for quite some time to come. 4070, $200 cheaper, still concerning, but certainly less so. And then, obviously, the real concern for me is if we get a $400-ish 8GB card. That's going to be pretty brutal. But anyway,
Yeah.
that's a whole different topic, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
It's certainly like something that we'll need to be evaluating quite a lot over the next year or two. These things really do creep up once game engines drop support for older consoles, because a lot of the effort that goes into making those older games work with 8 gig cards is that they were trying to make them run on things like a PS4 or an Xbox One, which do not have as much memory as the new consoles. So a lot of that optimization work goes in there. Once those things get cut out of the picture and they're not bothering with that, again, the main target for their games are those newer consoles. Means there's going to be a lot more. I think we'll see a lot more games where the low texture quality settings are very much like what we see in The Last of Us, where it's not really very well optimized at all. Not a lot of effort is put in there, because again, the target market there are like low end PC gamers, and they just don't like. Well, it's hard enough to get a PC port working well on high end cards, let alone the entry level stuff. Like the amount of care that goes in is not amazing.
If they've optimized the game for 12 gigabytes of VRAM or 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and they have actually optimized the game to look as good as possible while using that much memory, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can make it look nearly as good with 8. Like, it could be quite a significant downgrade, or it could just be a lot of extra work to make that happen, and they're not willing to do it because really to play the game, that's what you need. Like, they've, again, designed it with consoles in mind, which means on PC you need X amount of memory. So, yeah, and I mean, you could argue that, the developers that do go and optimize the games to look really... It's a tough rabbit hole to go down, because these new games, they change the type of textures they're using, the way they're applying them. It's not like a tile-based texture render where they just, rock texture, throw that on all the rocks. And if they're starting to give rocks unique textures and different big rock texture, medium rock texture, whatever it is, even different types of rocks. Like, not all rocks are the same, right? Yeah. So you get different rock textures. And so they've really optimized using up the 12 gigabytes of VRAM to give you this really photorealistic environment. And then you're kind of loading in different textures. It's to make it optimized for medium, where it works under 8 gigabytes or up to 8 gigabytes. It's a different way of going about it. So it can be quite difficult. All I know is, again, I'm not a game developer, but we've heard from game developers, and they're just saying it's very frustrating and it wastes a lot of time and resources optimizing these cutting edge latest games to work on older hardware. And a lot of them aren't interested in doing it anymore. They've been doing it for so long. As Tim talked about earlier, there's a lot of games that are like just in the 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer at like maybe even 1440p, 1080p. And they want to do more things with the game now.
Yeah, and game developer resources are very stretched. I don't want to give excuses for developers saying
there's definitely some crap games.
There's definitely games with poor optimization and so on, and plenty of issues, and a lot of games launched too early and things like that. Don't want to discount all that, but when it comes to developer resources, they're going to make a list of priorities for things. What's the most important things to address? What's the least important things? And it's always going to be getting the game working, making sure there's no game-breaking bugs, and those sorts of things are going to take priority over optimizing for lower-end systems, especially if they're clearly telling people via their recommended and minimum specs what the game can and can't be played on. I mean, they wouldn't want a situation where they're saying this will work on 8 gig cards and then it doesn't. But if they're telling people, hey, for our recommended spec for this is a 12 gig or 16 gig card, and that's what they're delivering, then that certainly is... they're not false advertising or doing anything like that. And, I found it sort of as a tangent. I was watching the Psychonauts 2 documentary that's on YouTube, which goes for 20 hours or 30 hours or something over I don't know how many parts it is. As a non-game developer, I found it very interesting, some of the things that they were and weren't prioritizing, even to get the game out on console. Even just we know this is a bug with the game, it's a graphical artifact or something, but we don't have the time to fix that. We're only focused on the game break, the certification level breaking bugs. And we're just going to ignore all of the shadow clipping and things and hope people don't notice that. But they had this massive document with all of the issues that they know about, and they'd go through and they'd be like, we're not fixing that. We're not fixing that.
Or we're not fixing it before launch, but we will eventually get to it one day. But it's a low priority fix.
Exactly. So things like optimizing for the lower tier, low spec hardware is definitely not going to be a certification level issue where Microsoft or Sony are going to come out and say, we played the game and we can't finish it. Those are the bugs that they, and this team of people was like, they didn't have that many people working on this game, and they were like flat out, and it was over budget and over schedule and all these sorts of things. It's a very interesting insight into how those sorts of issues at the studio can play out into affecting those sorts of things. And certainly I think that's going to be an issue as games get more complicated. You've got teams of like thousands of people working on games taking 5 years to develop. And that's just to get the game, like all the features they want in, all the gameplay elements, all the graphics that they want in the way they want it. And those things are going to be further and further deprioritized. And, we can sit here saying, hey, game developers, you need to make it work on 8 gig cards, but there has to be a point where we're talking about this in a more realistic way, like understanding all the different things that can, play out. And one of the easiest fixes is just giving more VRAM on GPUs. Like, that's an easy solution to the problem.
Yep.
And yeah, maybe it's the more expensive way, and people can argue and say game developers should do a better job. But if there's a fix there, that's obvious, everyone knows is a solution, then I think that is the path that we should be going down.
It's pretty funny as well that gamers are expecting games to work at really impressive visuals on 8 gigabyte cards indefinitely. Like, where was the 2 gigabyte or 1 gigabyte VRAM gamers that were complaining that games use 2 or 4 gigabytes now, and then 4 gigabytes eventually, got phased out, and it was 8, especially if we're talking at the high end. So I don't know. I don't really know what to say about that. Like, we want it to get better. It's just a shame that we've been fed 8 gigabyte graphics cards at the mid range for so many years now.
Yeah, I think I think most people understand where we're coming from and agree with our opinion. I think the people who are sort of thinking like 8 gig is still good enough for people that, and again, this is a perfectly fine point to make is, they've bought those mid-range cards and are feeling the pinch now, and they want, they don't want to buy that new product. They don't want to change what they have, and they're feeling a little bit annoyed about the situation and sort of thinking, well, I spent $600 on my 3070 Ti, and you're telling me it's not playable within 2 years? That's BS. Like, surely game developers should be putting in more effort. And it's like, well, maybe the issue there was not necessarily your buying decision in that person's case, but more that NVIDIA should have given you more VRAM. So, I sort of feel the pain of those people a little bit. And, even at the time, us as reviewers, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the VRAM was sort of a minor issue. It wasn't like, hey, in 2 years, we know for a fact your GPU won't work.
It would have been nice if we did.
In these games in ultra quality settings. So, it's a very, very complicated thing. But yeah, as we move to new game engines and they're trying to do more impressive things, it's something we're just going to have to keep evaluating as we go through that transition. And it happened back in the day with titles like Assassin's Creed Unity coming out and people being like, oh, wow, this game runs terribly on PC. But that game tried to do crazy things with NPCs at the time. It was using more CPU resources, and they were just trying things out, see what works. And we're going through that at the moment now. So a lot of evaluation is still to come to see what the impact is. I imagine what's definitely going to happen is games will come out that will run fine on 8 gig cards, and people will point to that and be like, hey, that's a really well optimized game. It's fine on 8 gig cards. What were you complaining about? That'll definitely be a thing that will come up. So we'll just keep evaluating.
That's reasonable as well. There will be some good quality games that work well on, but it's always that little, because it's what we've talked about. It's that just bleeding over, right?
Yeah.
To working and not working. It can be a fine line. And it won't be until games actually require, 16 gigabytes of VRAM, for example, that they look noticeably better. But you don't get there by just jumping from there to there. Like, you've got to create. We see this with everything. Like, a new feature gets announced, and people are like, "Oh, the Radeon RX 5700 XT is an old, ancient, dead RDNA architecture. It's going to be terrible because it doesn't support this DirectX 12 Ultimate feature. It doesn't have this. It doesn't." We're years down the track now, and the 5700 XT is looking absolutely amazing because all these features take so long to get implemented in games. And that, like, look at DirectX 12, for example. I was talking about DirectX 12 long before we had a YouTube channel as being the next low-level API, Mantle kicked things off there. And
it's even longer today.
Well, there's still games like, Dying Light 2 plays technically better in DirectX 11. Like, if you put it on the highest quality preset, it opts for DirectX 11. It's not until you want to use ray tracing it's like, okay, we're going to use DirectX 12 now, but that's not the most optimal API for performance. If you even use the DirectX 12 API in Dying Light 2 and disable ray tracing, the game gives you a notification saying this is not the most optimal API for the game. We recommend switching to DirectX 11. And that's like a newly released game.
Yeah.
So
I just like, it's crazy to think that right now, game developers are probably thinking about the engine that they'll need to use for the next generation of consoles, like the PS6. Like that's how long these things are taking. Like even Unreal Engine 5, which has been, available, so to speak, for a year, more than a year now, a couple of years as an engine people can use. Again, it may still be, I don't know, 3-4 years until it's a widely used engine.
Well, it's still a work in progress as well.
Yeah, like games are going to come out that are targeting next-gen consoles built on Unreal Engine 4. Like, it's just those big AAA titles, the games like Cyberpunk, which really should have, been developed for maybe a couple more years before it was released. Those games take entire console generations to make. So some of the decisions that are made well before, that's why those cards like the 5700 XT last for so long. People talk about all those, the ultimate features like mesh shaders and all those sorts of things. That's not going to be used for so long.
Well, and yeah, what you're saying is correct, but also the jump from game developers primarily using like Unreal Engine 4 to 5, that will see quite a big incremental jump. But even then, what we see initially won't be the best example of what that game engine can deliver. You'll get that years down the track. But it's constant progression, but it may not be as fast as what people like, and then at times it's faster than what people like. But it's just this slow, and it does happen in sort of little leaps. But it's not like you go from 8 gigabytes of VRAM to 16. It's like you go from 8 to 8.5, 9, and it creeps up.
And it's very different to something like CPU performance, where we have seen step jumps in CPU performance, but it's not like, some games may run okay still, even if they're using more CPU resources. Whereas with the VRAM side of things, it very much is you spill over a little bit and you're into major issues. Whereas, CPU side of things.
Well, I know what you're saying. That I hate to use the CPU core thing, but generally when an architecture can't scale up more, that's when the cores become a problem. But let's just say overall CPU performance. If you have a CPU that just doesn't have enough performance to play like Hitman 3, for example, that's when you get all stuttering, all kinds of problems. And you can't, in games where you can't like dial down NPC density or some sort of CPU overhead type setting, the only way to improve that is to get a CPU with more performance.
Yeah.
So... but yeah, I know what you're saying as well. It's technically right. But yeah, we had 4-core CPUs forever, and then people weren't upset when we started to get... Well, we got 6 and 8-core CPUs, and then people were upset that the games weren't using the 6 and 8-core CPUs, and then eventually it did, and then 4-core CPUs didn't have enough overall CPU performance. And
then those people complain. So you're stuck in a hard place because, like, surely people with an RTX 4090 that have bought a card with 24 gig of VRAM want the 24 gig used.
Yeah.
Like, if the game can look better by using all that VRAM, then that should be an option for people.
And it definitely could.
But then you run to the issue where people will just crank the game up to Ultra, which is designed for 24 gig of textures or whatever, and then people with lower tier cards, it doesn't run very well. So, yeah, it's a mess. It's a mess. And, it's the difficult things with game development, and, we're seeing games get more and more complicated, and
what seems to standardize that is the consoles.
Yeah.
But again, it doesn't happen. And this is another example I've been saying. They release the new console, PS5, whatever. They release it, and games all of a sudden don't just use more VRAM because they have more unified memory to access. It's this slow thing that takes years. And we're seeing that lag now catch up to where the consoles are actually being utilized to their fullest.
Because there's a lot of games that would have been released in the last 2 years that were started development, 2018.
Mm-hmm. And they were designed to work on older consoles as well, obviously.
Like at the time, like if you're starting a game development in 2018, it's 2 years prior to the new consoles being released. You may have some idea of what they're going to do, but you don't have the hardware in hand to test it on. And there's all sorts of things there. Whereas, especially next year in 2025, we're going to be getting games that are developed that have been, the development has started after the consoles have been released. Mm-hmm. And it's usually that sort of those late generation games that really start pushing those capabilities. They really start using all those sorts of features. So I would expect that, within the next years, we're going to get a lot of those big step up games where people are like, whoa, this is really impressive. And that's just because they're utilizing the new features because they can.
I'm just smiling right now because I'm thinking we could have just done like a monthly podcast on VR. We've talked about this question we've addressed. We should move on to the next one.